Hello to everyone joining. We're going to get started in just a minute here, just letting everybody in. Make sure that your microphones are on mute just for this first portion as you join. Good morning to everyone joining. I'm going to get started in just a moment here. So I'm actually just going to get started with a couple of housekeeping items as we're letting people in. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jess Rebar. I'm a special projects manager for Merit HR and today's event moderator. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our first event of 2021. So happy New Year, and hope that your families are all healthy and happy and doing well. And we certainly appreciate you spending some time with us this morning to share and learn together. I know that today's event is of particular importance in today's complicated environment, DEI and inclusive leadership. Wanted to get just a couple of housekeeping things done before we get started here. Again, ask that everyone's microphone is muted for today's discussion portion. There will be an opportunity to engage with our panelists and with each other during breakouts. During the presentation, if you have a question, please utilize the chat feature. I will be constantly monitoring the chat and will be asking questions on your behalf at the end of our presentation. In the event that we do run out of time for the questions and answers, I'll ask that our panelists provide a quick written answer to the questions that we're not able to get to, and I can send those out after the event as a Q&A attachment. And as a note, I'm the only person that can see the chat feed, so your questions will be anonymous unless otherwise specified. A recording of today's event will be posted on the Merit HR YouTube channel next week, so be sure to subscribe and check that out. We also have the recording of our last event as well, and we'll be posting some really interesting content on there as well. So again, be sure to subscribe to that. And I'll be sending a link to that to everyone who did register. And lastly, we always want these discussions to be helpful and engaging. So to the extent that you have feedback or have questions, please feel free to reach out to Danica Davis or myself, and we'll be happy to address that or chat with you about your thoughts. And with that, I'd like to welcome Merit HR Managing Director and CEO, Danica Davis, to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. It's always gratifying to see so many familiar names, and even more gratifying to see so many new ones. I hope to be able to talk with you all one-on-one at some point in the near future. Today, we are talking about a concept that is simultaneously foundational and yet aspirational. For those of us who've been at this for a long time, we've been at this for a long time. Inclusive leadership is as a norm. There is no more important work in human resources, in my opinion, than ensuring that our workplaces are environments of respect and inclusion, and beyond that, of belonging, where folks come to us, do meaningful work, and feel as though everything they are is welcome in the workplace. And for beyond it being the right thing to do, it has also been proven to drive business results. So pick your answer. I don't care which one it is. I hope it's the right thing to do. But we are talking about inclusive leadership today. I am a recovering HR practitioner, a lifelong HR and as Jess mentioned, I now spend my time working with the great folks at Merit HR who have focused exclusively on helping organizations achieve their goals through fantastic HR professionals for 31 years now. So hopefully we figured a little bit out over that time. We'd like to jump right into a very meaty topic, and this time frame does not do it justice, but we're going to do our best. We've brought you two exceptional thought leaders in this space. Our panelists today are Dr. Julianna Hines, who is a leadership development strategist, coach, speaker, and she has recently published a book, Leading on Purpose, The Black Woman's Guide to Shattering the Glass Ceiling. Welcome, Julianna.
Thank you.
Doster, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a good long time now. Grant is a strategic diversity and inclusion executive who uses analytics and technology to create innovative methods and results to accomplish a lot of things, but also to really bring that message and results of belonging home to the businesses with whom he works. Thank you for spending time with us this morning and for sharing your thoughts. Let's get right in. And Julianna, if we can start with you.
Sure.
What is your definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in today's context? And what drove you to choose this work and your passion for it?
Yeah. So the go-to answer to that is what Grant is going to share, because I bit off of him to give that definition. But beyond that, and it's a great analogy that he'll share. I grew up in a racially diverse family and town right outside of San Francisco, and also here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And diversity was just part of my life. It wasn't anything that I fell into. It was just what I was born into, basically. And so what diversity looks like, and diversity, inclusion, equity, belonging, the word that came to me was acceptance. In either school with friends that were of a different culture, race, ethnicity, or in my own multicultural family, we just accepted one another. We loved one another. We played with one another. We enjoyed lunches and just had genuine relationships. So I would say, to define it, it would be acceptance and relationship.
Thank you, Julianna.
Welcome.
I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, the words we use, and specifically the word belonging. How about your thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you, Danica. And Jessica, thank you so much for pulling this together. It's a topic that I don't think we can get enough of, quite frankly. But I wanted to take advantage of this time too to give you a little bit of feedback, or not feedback, but a little bit of a broader scope of what led me to the definitions that I use. As the first VP, senior vice president, golf club member, I mean, you name it, over the years, especially early on in my career, as the first African-American or Black guy in a lot of these types of situations. I've seen it firsthand. I've been refused service. I've had to lay down face in the street for a routine traffic stop. And by the way, most people I know are not anti-cop. Matter of fact, I've got family and people that I love most in the world that are on the job. But even they, along with me and others, we're anti-brutality, anti-humiliation, against the disproportions that land on people of color. So really the contextual foundation of racism and the principles that can easily translate to other isms, my context is based on racism. And even though we all have our different isms that we have either perpetrated or suffered, please, as we talk about these definitions, look to the other isms: sexism, heterosexism, ethnocentrism, supremism in general. And classism, by the way. Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, gets into the US caste system and the stigma and dehumanization as a programming and systemic process used to create policies that favored a ruling class and really created a herd mentality. I know it's hard to think of Nazi Germany and think of some of the things, but some of those horrible, horrible historical things we must remember, otherwise we're doomed to repeat them. So that led to my premise that I've shared all over the world. And I start by saying, let's stop talking about diversity. The definition's been miscrewed. Kennedy signed an executive order in '61, and then Johnson expanded on it to clear the way for more diversity in federal employment. That was really the target. And of course, that of their contractors. Well, That led to a well-meaning companies hiring a bunch of Black folks and women. And although the sentiment was good and the idea was right, it did not lead to more inclusion. It led to polarization and infighting, and the battle over diversity really truly began way back then. So I'm chagrined to say that in some ways we've made great strides, and others we're no better off really than when I started this DEI journey and urged over 20 plus years ago. You've heard the statistics. 84% of Black adults say white people are treated better than Black people by the police. 63% of white adults agreed based on 2019 research. 87% of Black adults say U.S. criminal justice system is more unjust towards Black people. And 61%, by the way, of whites agree. According to the U.S. Bureau Justice Statistics, in 2008, Black males accounted for 34% of the total male prison population, while whites 29%, and Hispanic males 24%. Yet Black males are only 5% of the general population, whereas white males are more like 30%. So either Black males are biologically and inherently naturally evil, which of course we know that not to be true, or there's a discrepancy in how justice is dealt out. So all these statistics must be met with. And by the way, now we understand that COVID-19 has been disproportionately affecting people of color. Students canceling school plans and work experiencing wage and job loss are also disproportionate, to the tune of 50% and 61% respectively for Hispanics, and 42 and 44% for Blacks. So all those things being said, and by the way, let me not rule out also my middle-aged straight white guys. According to MindGym, a global talent development company, they say that 45% of straight white guys don't feel like they fit in at work either. So that's why I say, as far as the definitions go, let's start with belonging, not diversity, because belonging is something that we all want. It's the feeling that, I'm included, and it makes me want to stay. Equity is evening the playing field. So sometimes it's a little bit more or less, but we're trying to strive for equilibrium. And then inclusion is a choice that we bring in to facilitate a really robust experience around diversity, which is really just meaning differences. And everybody in that room is different. So Verna Myers, our colleague from Netflix, said, diversity is being asked to dance, inclusion is being asked to dance. I'm sure you've heard that analogy. Well, I've added, belonging is never wanting to leave the dance floor. So as we talk about this and end this discussion, let's keep that in mind. If you have a different idea of what diversity is, racism, go back to Kendi's book where he talks about its racist policies and racist ideas that normalize racial inequities. By that definition, we're hard pressed not to say that we are not all in some way suffering from perpetrating these isms, racism, sexism, and so forth. But belonging is something we can all get our hands around and something we all want to do. I hope you agree.
Thank you very much, Grant. You can hardly tell you've given this a lot of thought over those 24 years of doing this important work. I think it's fascinating to think in the terms of language, as well as to just rail against isms of any type. And I agree with you that while definition of diversity can be confusing at times to some of us, that the definition of belonging is so much more approachable. And if that becomes our goal, perhaps we'll finally make strides against and implement these types of work environments, societal environments that make people feel so. And I think you're going to have a bit of a bully pulpit for a moment, because I have the next question for you as well. We're coming right back to you, Julianna, unless you have something to add at this time about what Grant just said.
Well, one thing I always add on the end of belongings being never wanting to get off the dance floor and no one wanting you to get off the dance floor. That's what I add to it.
Right.
Okay.
And I did share about my passion. I just wanted to tell this story really quickly for others to get a sense of, as Grant did, what African Americans and women face. So I grew up, again, in a very multiracial family and school and town, and then went to school in Sacramento, came right back to the Bay Area. And my plans for marriage kind of fell apart. But I managed to have a baby in the process, and I had to move back home with my parents. So that changed how I was going into the workforce or how I thought about it. And I found a job at a container terminal at the Port of Oakland, where all the leaders I worked with, or most of the leaders I worked with, were white male, military backgrounds, made like 4 times as much money as I did. And here I was, this young, ambitious single mother, Black single mother, coming into this workforce, trying to figure out where I fit. And the two just didn't jive. They didn't know how to lead me, and I didn't know how to be led by them or to ask for what I wanted. So that's really what started my passion in diversity and inclusion. And I share that story, and I have tons of stories to share in that experience, but I share that story just to give a flavor of what it could be like to be in that type of environment and not feeling like you fit, not feeling like you belong, and really trying to find the opportunities to advance and grow.
Thank you for that, Julianna. Grant, as we've just learned, you've spent the majority of your career coaching, leading, teaching DEI and B initiatives for Fortune 1000 companies around the globe. Recently, and we all know the recently part, there's been a much more visibility, a lot more optics on this long-standing topic of folks wanting to broaden their policies around diversity inclusion. You see programs coming up, you see it being a specific job now inside of organizations of all sizes to help do this important work. Who is ultimately responsible for these policies and practices in the workplace?
That's a great question, Danica. And I think that instinctively, we all believe the same answer, and that's everyone. There's not a single person in an organization that's not responsible for making sure that belonging, inclusion, and diversity and equity continue to grow. Now, that being said, of course, it starts with compelling CEO vision and rewarding the right behavior according to McKinsey. If it doesn't start there, there's a pyramid that they use in their diagram. And in that pyramid, if we don't have management accountability and we don't have a commitment that cascades down, then it's game over regardless. You know, people at the lower rungs of the organization can do everything that they want to do, and they might create good pockets for themselves. You know, you've heard often that people don't leave their companies, they leave their bosses. Conversely, for an organizational metamorphosis and continued growth, healthy growth, it requires a not at the top, and then a compelling vision and execution against a strategy that puts the right things in place. You know, for us individually, though, self-awareness as to whether or not we support ISM policies or not, we have to get on the hook in order to get off the hook. We can no longer deny these things that are in our heads. We're accredited in psychological safety, and it's rooted in the fact that we've got in our brains a safety mechanism that shuts things down that we feel threatened by. And if we don't face those things, then we're doomed to fall prey to our brains before we have a chance to think through them. We need a desire to make things right for everyone, including ourselves, and really making a conscious effort to reach across the aisle and compromise, not your values, but your practices. We have to sacrifice a little bit of what we want so that our neighbor can get what they need. Without that, starting at the top and then working through the organization from a policy standpoint, and then all of us taking on those responsibilities personally, and making sure that each critical interaction, that if you feel like you belong, as I'm talking to you, and I walk you through the party and introduce you to people as opposed to saying, come on in and have some punch. If I'm doing that, I'll be a good leader, I'll be a good follower, and I'll be a good partner. But in the absence of that, then as I said, I think in my opening salvo, you know, I hope not to be chagrined to see that we're in the same place that we were 20 years ago, 20 years from now.
The same question. You do a lot of consulting in this area as well. Who is ultimately responsible for these programs and policies and all of the P's? Who's responsible for all of these P's, including the people, and driving belonging in the workplace?
I would 110% agree with Grant. You know, it's all of our responsibility. And if it's not driven from the top down, it's going to be difficult to sustain. And as he said, we might be able to sustain it in organizations in pockets. So the challenge then becomes how do you get an audience or sit and talk with your leader about the importance of it and encourage that message to go up if it's not coming down? So everything else Grant said, I say what he said.
Well, Julianna, any specific tactics that you've seen work? Because say you have somebody passionate about belonging and or getting rid of isms, and how do they start that conversation?
Yeah, when I coach leaders, that question is kind of common in terms of influence, because that's what we're talking about. And so when you think about influence, there's a relationship that has to be built, or that should be built. There's an understanding of what that other individual's goals and responsibilities and what they're trying to accomplish, kind of like the what's in it for me. That has to be understood. And then you can sit down and marry what you're trying to accomplish with how you're helping them to accomplish their goals through this process. And I think that would be an easier conversation to have, because then there's the business case.
Grant, anything to add to that on kind of how you kick it off?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I talked about accountability. I'm just building on what Julianna said, because she's so right on. By the way, we obviously have partnered for years, so we can finish each other's sentences. But the accountability piece, I think, is going to become more and more important as we go right now. There's been instances, and I look at life as a bell-shaped curve, and here are the small tails of really, really bad to really, really good. And most of us on any given day operate someplace in that middle, that 80%. So the idea is to move off the mean and move towards this and see constant progress. So progress over perfection, but moving the needle forward. And unfortunately, in the absence of accountability, we have subjectivity. We don't have objectivity. So it's important that the goals be not only SMART, specific, measurable, action-based, results-oriented, and timely, but they also be something that we can actually discuss and have the skill to converse about. So using a coaching conversations type of vehicle to teach leaders how to have these conversations, to not be uncomfortable saying the word LGBT or gay or LGBTQ or Black or women or whatever. And when you inevitably stick your foot in your mouth, learn how to graciously pull your foot out of your mouth, apologize, and ask for some feedback on how you can improve, as opposed to what tends to be the discourse we're using currently, which is to double down. So learning how to navigate through conversations is going to help us accomplish those accountable goals. Carrots are good. Have the senior executive team have incentives, not just for demographic changes in the workplace, but also the behavioral changes and the business results that happen as a result of all this upward mobility for the staffers. James White, one of my mentors when he was at Gillette, I think he's semi-retired now, but he was the former CEO of Jamba Juice. He came in and he said that because he was the CEO, he had the authority to do what some CEOs don't, and that is to actually make these policy changes and hold people accountable. As a result, he saw a 500% increase in his market cap. So we know this stuff works. We just have to actually do it, and we have to take it seriously. One last note real quickly. I carry this around with me. It's a study done for Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. And it shows the demographic changes and how they're not necessarily moving the needle like they would like it, but they're at least admitting it, and they're at least holding themselves accountable to it. But the byline is what I like. It says, if you wasted $1 billion and you're nowhere near your target, you wouldn't get a bonus. You wouldn't even have a job. And yet there seems to be no consequences. Despite all the words, despite all the money, despite all the platitudes and initiatives, it's hard to say that companies are really taking this seriously. So at the end of the day, we have to take it seriously. Last note, if we have people who aren't doing the right thing, I don't believe in zero tolerance policies for the sake of zero tolerance policies. If someone's displaying behavior that's moving the needle forward, then that's coaching. If someone is constantly trying to rip apart what you're trying to do as a company in the way of this initiative, and they say the wrong thing, then chances are you should have believed them the first time. And maybe that's counseling. But at the end of the day, you do not promote that individual to levels of increased power, because it sends the absolute wrong message. And I've seen that happen with companies time and time again.
Me too.
Was it Maya Angelou said, when somebody shows you who they are, believe them?
Believe them the first time. That's right.
Believe them the first time, exactly. And if they don't know, get them some coaching, right? If
Get them
if
some coaching.
they don't have the techniques, but they have the heart for it, then that's a trainable moment, a teachable moment.
Give me those folks any day.
Yeah.
Because they've admitted what's going on. They've admitted that they've fallen short and they're not really sure. So get those folks some help, just like if they had a drug problem or anything else. If they didn't know how to do a task, we give them training. Conversely, if somebody doesn't want to do the work, regardless of what that is, including diversity, inclusion, and belonging, then they should be helped out with an opportunity, perhaps at another firm that is more in line with their behavior.
Sometimes you have to free up somebody's future.
Love the way you put that.
Julianna, your most recent book is specifically about Black women in the workforce and touches on many other things. And so help us understand how diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging might transcend just race, which has been the most common thing we've been talking about in recent months anyway. How do we ensure that our efforts aren't limited to race?
Absolutely. So my first thought is to do an assessment of what each organization, what your organization needs. So perhaps it is racially diverse, but there are not many LGBTQ members of the LGBTQ community in your organization. How can you recruit for that? And how can you invite others to be a part of that conversation? Or, there's not enough women like in STEM organizations or STEM, professions, then how do you recruit for that? And not just at the same organizations and resources maybe that you've used before and haven't been successful. Try other resources to recruit those individuals. And so again, it's really about, once you understand who you need and what you need, then it's putting a plan together, a strategic plan. So maybe it's, black, white, green, and purple. You need 4 people and you don't have that. Then you put a strategic plan in place like you would do for anything else and identify what is the overall goal, what are the steps that we need to take, who's responsible for it, what outcome are we looking for, and when do we expect that outcome to happen?
Grant, anything to add to that on expanding DEI beyond race?
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And as I said earlier, isms are isms. And anytime one group feels that their agenda or their needs or what they want is superior to another group, that's an ism. As I said, my context is mostly based on sexism. Slowly but surely, it's turning into ageism.
Me too, Grant.
So there's a lot of isms, but if one group is in the power dynamic, then you can be assured that there is the risk of an ism forming. So if you have a company that is nothing but, people who wear beautiful green jackets, then you can be assured, per that Stanford study, if you folks remember from years ago, where the jailers, had other students that became prisoners, and they had to stop the study because the jailers started to physically abuse, their fellow students. There's just this dynamic. Again, it's a brain science. It's neuro, to take on the supremacy of the power dynamic, usually led by the boss, and then that turns into the culture of the company. So in order to change the culture, we all have to start to metamorphosize, how we're approaching these critical interactions one by one, so that they'll add up to what Julianna said, and hitting those objectives and the measurements. And so that way, as you're doing your dashboard assessments, you're seeing a constant progress and a constant amelioration of what's happening in that organization.
Thank you, Grant. Any final thoughts on that, Julianna?
As he was speaking, I was thinking, I am a member of a community church here in my area, and my pastor says he wants it to be a multicultural church, but it's mostly Black folks at the church. So this is kind of a flip of that. And I have a relationship with him that I could call him on it, and things that he might say from the pulpit that might come across a little sticky for some people. So helping, to Grant's point, it doesn't always have to be a white organization or about race, but helping people to be mindful of what they say they want and then the behaviors they are doing to try to get it.
There's a good
Yeah,
consultant that
I,
says,
I,
"Not a brain, you
let me
got
just jump on.
bias."
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Grant.
Oh, I'm sorry. My mute button is on and off, but I just wanted to just completely jump on that with Juliana. We happen to share that, our faith. And, and by the way, it's of my opinion that people aren't uncomfortable with the fact that I have a certain faith. They're uncomfortable if I'm condemning them for not having it. And I think that that is really vitally important for I think it's called triumphalism, where one person's religion takes a superiority over another person's religion. And this social discourse that we have, I think it's compelling reason to really have conversations, but have equitable conversations that allow us to share things. And my faith, it's all about love. I got to love my neighbor. I'm supposed to love my enemy. There's not any room for hate. So, I just think that's an important distinction as well. And it's important that we reach across the pulpit, as well as the aisle, as well as the office next to us, to create those conversations and not shy away from them.
Thank you, Grant. Juliana, as HR practitioners, and there's more than HR practitioners in this room, so leaders of any kind, it's our responsibility to create and enforce is a strong word, but I'll say enforce, that often falls to HR, that are designed to create this psychological safety, this feeling of belonging and inclusion for all members on our team. It's also our responsibility to lead by example. But we also know that understanding is different than action. Well, can you share with us how we can identify things we might be doing wrong, even unintentionally, things that you've seen in your practice that well-meaning people are just getting in their own way in this arena?
Great question. It goes back to what I said for the other question. It's about relationship. Number one, getting feedback and finding out what are you doing wrong. So you could do that through a formal 360 process, or with people from different cultures or different gender or whatever the concern is, and sitting down and asking them if you could sit down and have a conversation with them about X, and being really explicit. This is what I'm interested in talking about. This is my concern. Are you open to having that conversation? I say that like that because I'm one that if someone were to ask me anything about race, religion, what have you, I'm happy to share. Not everybody's like that. So it's showing the respect that you're not trying to just barge in and get the answers for answer's sake, but that you're genuinely interested, and you're showing that, respect, if you will, of the other individual. I remember when George Floyd was first murdered, I was bombarded with emails and phone calls from non-Black colleagues that were concerned, but that left me feeling very overwhelmed, because those that reached out to me were looking to me for the answers. And so that's a second thing, is to, and I'm sure, or maybe some of you have heard this already, but not to burden the person who is part of that group with educating you or teaching you about the nuances, although that's a piece, it could be a piece of it, but it's also going out and finding that information for yourself. There's so much, you all know, there's so much on the internet, you can't not find that information. One resource I can share is, well, actually two. Harvard has a implicit bias assessment that you could take for free. Some of you might know about this. You could take it around race, gender, sexual orientation, and probably about 10 others. There's a lot that they have looked at. And I've taken it and been pretty surprised at some of the results, where I thought I was open-minded and accepting at least the assessment the way I filled it out said no. So it gave me a very clear, at least idea of where my mindset, where my thoughts are, and what I can do, where I can start in terms of doing differently. one more one more resource for everyone is I've worked with a company, I've coached at a company called Inclusion Inc. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them, but they specifically do 360 feedback and debrief and coaching with senior leaders. So that's another resource. If it's again, it goes back to feedback and then finding the solution, figuring out how to compensate or not compensate, how to build on what you already have or know.
Thank you for sharing those resources, Julianna. A colleague of mine has an expression: if you've got a brain, you've got bias. And
Mhm.
it's it's hard to challenge our own, right? Most of us, especially who practice HR, think of ourselves as being pretty open and savvy in these areas. And you just brought up something I think is incredible in so many areas of leadership, which is ask, right? We spend so much time thinking about what we're going to tell without taking the time to ask. And Grant, how about you? How can we identify things we're doing wrong, even unintentionally?
Yeah, I love your idea of asking. Now, there's a difference between intellectual curiosity and morbid curiosity.
Okay.
Intellectual curiosity is once you get to know something, the first question perhaps that one should ask is, "Hi, I'm Grant. What's your name?" I did a webinar with Walmart's director of diversity inclusion, Russell Schaefer, who is a blind man and very high ranks of Walmart. But he tells the story of how, people would be asking him the most obscene questions about being blind, and they don't, so somebody in the crowd appropriately asked because they didn't know. So what should we say? We feel uncomfortable. He says, well, you can start with asking me my name. And I thought that was the profundity of that was just not lost on me. As a practitioner, I'm not just a victim, I'm a perpetrator. So for all of us, especially in human capital space, that think we're immune, you got to drop that right away. But as far as allyship, and I just a second on that, be proactive in your approach. Don't wait to screw up and ask, intellectually once you get to know people. Educate yourself, as Juliana says. Don't rely on the Black folks, for instance, to tell you all about racism. For the future, they've already got a perception and they're going through it. If you genuinely want to know and you just can't find the resource any other way, just know that there's reciprocity involved for using that time. But this is not a pep rally. So allies stand with or behind the affected people first, because it's important that you don't, if I'm a man and I'm going to rescue those women, that is not only patronizing, it's going to be ineffective. So I want to stand behind or with my women colleagues to make sure that I completely understand where they're going, what they're going through, and how I can help, what my place is. And then lastly, pace yourself and keep hope alive, regardless of what it is you're anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-heterosexism. It's important that you know that this is, you got to come up with a 20-year plan. We've been fighting this forever, not only in this country, but around the world. So it's important that you pace yourself and allow yourself to see constant growth, and not let go of it. So I just wanted to add those things about allyship because I think it goes right in line with what you're discussing.
Are there other symptoms that we're not being an ally that aren't a 360 survey? I mean, anything that either of you can share that might lead us to think that we have work to do in our organizations?
I'll just say this one thing real quickly. You said it already. 1 out of every 1 person has one type of bias. You can look it up. There's 50 of the most notable, is 200 or more that are written about. And you can just start off with 4 or 5 that maybe apply to you. But coming up and finding out what biases you have, because we've got 11 million things swimming around on our minds at any one time. And we take shortcuts because we can only handle 40. So, and for some of us like me, perhaps even 19 or 20, I don't know. But at the end of the day, the first step is to be proactive in figuring out what is it that I might be biased about? What is it that I'm not open to? And then walking into those conversations with an open mind, walking into those conversations, asking a lot of questions. If you feel yourself getting tense and starting to feel somewhat agitated, there's a good chance that you may be defending something that's not pure. and just really having the courage to be introspective in your thinking about that.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that, it is that introspective piece. I think we, to Grant's point, we have 1,000,003 things going through our heads. And when we see an individual, something goes through our heads about that person. If you can slow your thoughts down or be mindful enough to pay attention, that might be an indicator of where the bias is. You know, how are you receiving this person? Are you seeing them first as Black or as female or as gay or whatever it is? If that's the first thing you see, and I'm not saying that we should be colorblind. I was on a fireside chat and a woman shared that she said she was colorblind. I was like, I don't want you to be colorblind. I am a Black woman. I want to be a Black woman. I'm proud of that. But if that's something that you have to figure out how to maneuver because you don't know, that might be a bias.
There's actually a term now for that. It's aversive racism. Whereas complicit is you allow things to happen, you may not be doing it yourself, but you help to reinforce it. Aversive racism is saying, I don't see color, so therefore there's no racism. Of course there is. There's no sexism. I don't see you as a woman, da 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 da. No, that's aversive sexism. So if you're not holding yourself accountable, then I can just about assure you that you're practicing an ism. And if you're not actively railing against that ism, then you are one. And Kendi says either you're an anti-racist or you're a racist. You know, I expand that to say either you're an anti-sexist or you're a sexist. If you're not doing things to break down those policies and proactively change them for the better for your whole organization, emotionally for you, as well as financially for you, because both of those things go in line with a better and healthier, less ismed organization. But if you're not actively involved with changing those things, then I can assure you, I'm going to take it a little bit further, that you are an ism. You are an ist. Pick one or several.
And I would just add to that, Grant said a very key word, which is accountability. Accountability for yourself and finding someone that could be accountability partner. It might be someone you're in meetings with, and unfortunately we're all online right now, but I always tell my clients, you know, have someone kick you under the table or, you know, give you feedback once you're out of the room about your performance on whatever it is. So you could also do that and hold each other accountable, which then expands the work in the organization.
A little skunk works for accountability. Start with one colleague and then they got two more and they got two more and they got two more, like that old Pearl commercial.
Yeah.
Good. We're coming right up on to time for our breakout session where folks can get together and talk about what's going on in their own workplaces and their thoughts. Maybe in this last moment here, a brief second on how we can, other than by leading by example, which I'm going to take that easy one away from you, engage our staffs and our teams.
That's a question?
Yes.
Okay. Grant, you want to take that?
Yeah. So, you know, I've started this kind of, I guess you can call it part of a tactical plan to my overall recruit, retain, and promote strategy. But it really centers around starting the conversations. First, again, with that compelling vision from the CEO and a strategic plan saying, here's what our targets are, not from a quota standpoint, but demographically, you know, we want to have a baseline to see kind of what's happening and then start to ease out of the demographics and get into more psychographics and more behavioral things, cognitive diversity, you know, how many ENFPs do we have on Myers-Briggs versus, you know, how many ISTJs, because this is the stuff that really drives innovation. By having the right people in the room and then promoting a psychologically safe environment. Again, being accredited in psychological safety, I found it to be relieving to know that my amygdala was showing up without me and I need to develop my prefrontal cortex, which will allow me then to have more productive conversations and not wound my fellow men in the workplace, because wounded soldiers can't fight, as opposed to being open to new ideas and looking towards innovation. So once that starts, and we have that understanding, we have that baseline, then we start to do things like not just the trainings. I think programming is great. I think accountability is a must, and we have to measure. But then we start at the root. We start with staff meetings, meeting in a box. Every week on the staff meeting at the lowest levels of the organization, you're having conversations about this stuff. You're having coaching conversations for your mid-level managers to make sure that they understand how to move the needle forward. You're making sure you're displacing people who aren't part of the program and don't want to move it forward. So all of these types of things are what's necessary. Me as an individual, again, it's really simple. Find that group of people that you know little about or you feel uncomfortable with, and you're ashamed to even say it, and go have lunch with them and have a conversation. And you start with, so what's your name? And then maybe after a series of days, weeks, or months, then you can move into, you know, something more personal. Do not walk up to a Black woman and say, can I touch your hair? Do not walk up to an Asian person and say something that is stereotypic. Do not walk up to a middle-aged straight white guy and just automatically think he's part of the Proud Boys. You know, we have to challenge ourselves, whatever your ism is, to really get to know that individual. And as we get to know those individuals, it's amazing what happens. I don't want to hurt you and you don't want to hurt me. And that's where the true sense of belonging comes.
You know, to add to that, what Grant said, I would encourage everyone to just have a genuine interest, a genuine curiosity. This isn't just about, let me do this because the organization is telling me to. Build relationships. You know, a lot of people will say, well, my Black friend at work, and even in my own family or people I talk to, they're like, oh, well, my white friend. I'm like, why do they have to be white? You know, what does that have to do with the story? And typically they're like, nothing. Okay, so drop that, you know, just your friend. And also, you know, Grant talked to, or Danica, you asked about starting with the staff. Maybe start with cognitive diversity. So you don't have to start on a really touchy subject right away. Get people's feet wet. So maybe you do a Myers-Briggs or a DISC or, you know, any other assessment to understand people's personalities. I was working with a client yesterday and he did something called the 6 geniuses. I had never heard of it. I don't know if anyone has. But then he asked me, well, how do I, if we, you know, we've identified a gap, how do we fill that gap? That's basically the whole concept of diversity, is identifying who you have, what they're good at.
I got to tell you, I didn't get to all the rooms, but I really enjoyed the conversation that I had with the rooms that I was in. And one of the things that I think is most important, and I won't name names, but is the actualization that we've all got room to grow.
Sure.
And we've all got a chance to continue our education. And even when we had one conversation where even when we're doing a good thing, you know, by making people feel comfortable with something that might feel uncomfortable for them and going out of our way to make sure that they belong. I had made the suggestion that I have found for me that I have to continue that conversation, and I have to continue to do fishbowl exercises and continue to check in to make sure that they didn't fall between the floorboards, because that could happen if we just normalize and say, okay, so everything's okay, right? And then we all fall back into old patterns. So anyway,
Right.
Thanks for those of you that let me in. I appreciate it.
So I am, let's see here. Let's get everybody back. Give a minute here to have everybody back. All right. So I'd like to ask a couple of people to share, but we do have some questions, so I might just kind of jump right into those. I think they're really great and important questions. So I think I'm going to skip to the question and answer portion, just given the time that we have. So here we go. Question 1, corporations have indicated that they want to diversify their corporate boards at least 5%. How can this be achieved, and what can we do to facilitate this?
Grant?
Yeah, so I'll jump in, and let me just make sure I keep my time in mind here. First and foremost, recruit, retain, and promote is not something that happens in a vacuum. You have to have a plan. So at all levels of the organization, you should be having a cogent plan for recruiting. I tell people at the lower levels, don't go to Howard University on career day with 15,000 other companies. You know, get people involved in your company. I'm an Alpha Phi Alpha member, a Black fraternity, 1906, Cornell University, the first Black fraternity anyway, but the best Black fraternity. But at the end of the day, and my friend Rich Soublé, I think, may disagree with me because I think he's another type of Greek. But anyway, at the end of the day, at the lowest levels of organization, that's where the love is found. That's where you really get people interested in the companies, is at that lower level. Well, guess what? Same thing at the board levels. You go and you involve yourselves with 100 Black men. You go and involve yourself with the Hispanic Grocers Association. You go and find the Pacific Islanders Association, and you talk to senior executives that are involved with those organizations. And guess what? They're primed for boards. They've been working in capacities, for years. So at the end of the day, you have to go where the fishing is good and not go where everybody else is. You wouldn't go and fish in that pond where all the boats are. So go find the place where it's just really rich with talent. And then you have to open your mind going in and displace all those biases that you're going in with, because you have them. And have a good, cogent conversation about where those folks are and how they can help your company grow.
And I would add to that, coming from a coaching perspective, is also expanding your vision of what you want your company to look like, and looking at the current leaders and who can you develop to position for those board seats. And as probably most of you know, the boards look for specific skill sets. So how are you building those skill sets in your existing organization? Not that they will end up on the board, but you're contributing to their own professional development.
That's great. A similar, I guess, or a continuation of that question. So after the Black Lives Matter protests, this person has seen a lot of organizations develop diversity committees. This person has seen organizations struggle to incorporate those initiatives. What can they do to help facilitate the conversations and help to move that conversation forward?
I have a friend.
You got muted, Julianna.
I don't know how that happened. Okay, I have a friend that's the chief diversity officer at a large healthcare organization. And she is new to that role, and she came in and started doing listening sessions. So it goes back to what we said earlier, going and talking with people and finding out what's needed rather than saying, here's what we're going to do. I think that's the first step, because then you can incorporate that into the strategy, the agenda, the conversations, and it creates much more of a rich experience for everyone, because you've pulled the information from the people that are experiencing it. And I'm not just saying just one group like Black or women or Hispanic, but the group as a whole. Identify a cross section of the organization and first find out what's needed.
That's a great point. We use quantitative and qualitative methodologies. Quantitatively is a macro sense in pulling in a lot of information from the base demographics and what's happening there for recruit, retain, and promote, to do you have a sense of belonging? How do you feel about inclusion? It's not just engagement, and it's not just best places to work. It has to go deeper than that. And you have to do it based on those demographics, because if you have an organization that says 87% of the people feel like they belong, well, that's awesome. Well, guess what? 87% of the people are middle-aged straight white guys. Of course they feel like they belong. 13% of the people feel like, no, I don't belong. So we really need to slice and dice to make sure that we're getting after the populations that are least served. And then the qualitative is meant to come in and have focus groups with folks to really try and buff out some of those answers and really try and find out and dig into why they're there. Not to evangelize about one way or the other, but just really trying to, Julianna's point, listen to what some of those concerns are. You can talk to your ERGs, your employee research groups. Doing a cross section of employee research groups is awesome, because other people get to hear more about what they have to say. Don't leave out your middle-aged straight white guys. They feel left out, like I said, 47% of the time too. I just think it's a really important dialogue that has to happen, because then as the plan comes out, everybody hears their voice in it, to Julianna's point.
So I have a little bit of a different angle on the same kind of context. So this person is a people leader, and as a white woman feels uncomfortable putting certain messages out to the entire company because she's white. She wants to support everyone from all walks of life. For Black History Month, she shared a calendar with resources, videos, etc. for the company. Didn't feel comfortable saying much else because of how it could be interpreted. Do you have any advice for her on how to approach company-wide initiatives in her shoes?
Well, Grant said it earlier, you have to create an inclusive culture. So it's not just one person, but making the effort, not, of course, I'm not saying she said this, but not only on Black History Month or Women's History Month, which is in March, but making a concerted effort organizationally, systemically, to create like I said, an accepting, a belonging, and inclusive organization. And that's going to take time. So until then, it goes back to listening. Go and get some feedback on how these messages are landing with people. Are they seeing it as great, or are they seeing it as this is disruptive? And that'll tell you where you go next, and if it's seen as disruptive, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying there might be some work to do around culture before you really see a change in the organization.
That is so right on. When we talk about bias, some biases aren't negative, but bias nonetheless there's a portion of ignorance that goes along with that. So rather than come out with, it's not that you're a white woman per se, it's that you may have a different perspective than what people that are subject or victimized by the situation are feeling. So I think it's incumbent upon you, as Julianna said, to talk to those folks, not just to curb, try and buff out the message, but really to find out, how do you feel about this? Where are we? We're thinking about going this direction. What do you think? Because then it represents as a whole something that makes sense to the holistic organization. Unfortunately, I was with an organization where right after George Floyd, the memo came out, and let's just say that it was lacking. And that sent the organization into a tizzy. And my recommendation is, if you're not prepared to put out a statement, then don't say anything, much less say something that just displays your ignorance. A lot of authors, Twain, Jesus, Lincoln, have taken this to be, the quote, but it's better to keep your mouth shut and let people think you're ignorant than open your mouth and remove all doubt.
My mom used to say, she had a saying, put your money where your mouth is. And Grant, you said, if you're not prepared to put out a statement, don't say anything at all. I would say, if you're not prepared to do something about that statement, don't put it out there. Often, since the George Floyd murder, I've seen company after company put statements out there, and the organization Grant was referencing is included. However, behind the scenes or behind that statement, it was like the Hollywood sign. It was just like these little sticks and stuff. There was no meat to it. Nothing was really, supporting it other than the illusion of what they wanted people to think. But they weren't even practicing it in-house. So I would add, like I said, be ready to back it up.
So, how do you identify and measure leaders' DEI behaviors and results? How do you hold them accountable?
You want me to swing away? All right. So let me just say, it starts with everyone understanding what the rules of engagement and the ground rules are and what the expectation is. And then, just like my article from Wired magazine, if you're not hitting your KPIs, then I don't care if you're the CEO and the board takes you to task, or you're on the shop floor and your supervisor takes you to task. You ought to have a counseling session about how to change that. Because if you ignore it, it sends a really bad message that this really doesn't matter. And I don't care if you've got $1 million producer, they have to have this conversation with equal importance and alacrity as you would have about his $1 million production or her $1 million production. So that's the first thing, is coming up with the objectives that make sense. And it's not about quotas, it's about behavior. And if your behavior is not consistent and you're doing things that are not just litigiously curious and inappropriate, but it becomes a cancer to the organization. That's going to drive down productivity. It's not a sustainable environment. I would encourage you to have those tough conversations like you would with anybody else.
And again, for a resource, Inclusion Inc. actually has an Inclusive Leader 360. You asked about leadership. And their assessment was created specifically to identify biases in 3 areas: gender, race, and generation. And if that is an area of some interest, I would say at least check them out, check out the website. I'm not getting paid for this, but it is a resource. The assessment is reliable, it's valid. Some PhDs designed it. So that's one place to start if you're looking to identify what the bias is in an organization, at least on those 3 levels.
Mm-hmm.
So one last question, and I thought this was really interesting. What if you just naturally connect with people that are similar or the same as you, right? What if there's just a natural, this person says vibe? How do you ensure that that's not seen as you're grouping, or you're siloing yourself, or only hanging out with people that are like you? How do you kind of navigate that situation when it's just kind of an organic relationship that happens?
Yeah, can I start this one off, Grant?
Yeah, please.
Number one, all of us have an affinity for one group or another, or one person or another. I would encourage, number one, to identify what that affinity is about. So why am I attracted to this person? Why do I enjoy talking to them? And yeah, you might assume because they're from the same town, or they're from the same culture, or the same sex, or gender, whatever it is. But really take some time to think about, what affinity do I have towards this individual? And then go find someone who, or not go find, but when you think about people who are different than you, and maybe you have to go find them, find that commonality, those same commonalities. So it might be that they grew up in the same era, or listen to the same music. Again, that's requiring you to sit down with someone and have a conversation, not just asking and listening, but sharing, so that you can find, well, what do we have in common, and we can build our relationship from there.
And we don't have time to get into the specifics, but again, dealing with the neuroscience, I'm finding absolutely fascinating, and psychological safety. We are tribe animals, and we have a tendency to take that first 1.5 seconds of impressions, and we take the packaging and say they're like us, when in fact, in a lot of situations, they're nothing like us. We don't, to Julianna's point, have any of the same types of interests or values. And unfortunately, the herd mentality takes over, and we just feel akin to that group because of the packaging. So I think Julianna's got a great way to approach it, and in asking questions, getting to know people, and some of the best friends that you're going to have once you get over yourself, as I'm trying to consistently get over myself to get around the packaging and embrace it. We find that we're more alike. And it's not a metaphor or some type of cliche. We are truly more alike in a lot of other instances other than the packaging that we see in the first 1.5 seconds. The only way you do that is to spend time and be open to, and find the other things that you can ingratiate yourself to more interesting than the packaging itself. But just know that your amygdala is not going to allow you to do this. You have to purposely go out and use your prefrontal cortex to penetrate that veil, so that you can get into the codex, which has 1 million different combinations. And I think you'll find that 999,000 of them are things that you really like, whereas the one thing that you're attracted to initially probably isn't the thing that really should have you stick.
That's great. Okay, so a couple minutes here. Maybe I'll ask each of you to give kind of a closing statement, or one thing that you can leave us with, one practical piece of advice, or maybe your specific goal for February as we wrap up here.
Well, I would say I appreciate everyone being here. Thank you, Merit HR, for having us. I would encourage each person to, identify first and foremost the perspective you're coming from, what your challenges and biases are, and then start having those conversations with others. But start with yourself. Start with yourself. Build relationships, genuine, interested relationships with individuals. And as Grant was speaking, I was thinking, and as soon as you do that and you've created that psychological safety, you might be able to go deeper with your questions and find out more about that person as a human being. So what is it like to be in your skin? But I wouldn't start there. I would start with, as Grant said, what's your name?
Thanks, Julianna. And I too want to thank Danica. Jess, you did a great job of pulling all this thing together. Let's all give her a golf clap. We would not have had this meeting without Jess. Thank you. And Danica is such a consummate professional. I've enjoyed working with you for years, and I just have the utmost respect for you and what you do. So Merritt, thank you so much. I'll just say this. If you find yourself applauding yourself for what a great job you're doing with inclusion and belonging, stop. We spend way too much time applauding ourselves for things that we think we're doing well, and we don't do enough to really get on the hook and do that really absurd thing that we call not self-denigrating or no self-degradation, but just really being honest with ourselves to say, you know what, I don't know enough about this. I don't know enough about that. And then do what Julianna said, go find that you don't know enough about and put yourself in the uncomfortable situation of finding out more about it. And then once you find out more about it, really start to interest yourself with the pain that goes along with being that woman, that person of color, that middle-aged straight white guy that doesn't feel like they belong because of whatever, that guy that's 6'9" or that guy that's 3'4", whatever your difference is. If it's different than you, go find out about it and see if you can help that person, at least with your own interaction, feel as though they belong. And then if we do that, then you'll help me with my mantra, which is to change the world one executive at a time. And one way or another, we're going to get to a point where we're not just singing Kumbaya and holding hands, but we're making money in the process because they walk hand in hand. This is a business discussion. It's not just a sensitivity discussion, and it is for all of us.
Great, thank you very much. Folks, if you'd like to learn more about our panelists, I have their email, their websites up on the screen here, dostertraining.com and juliannahines.com. And again, if you have questions about today's presentation or future presentations, feel free to give us a call or email. Both of our emails are here as well. Our next event is in April, and we are welcoming the Labor Commissioner for a conversation on best practices and guidances. And I'll let Danica talk a little bit about that as we wrap up.
Thank you, Jess. And thank you, Julianna and Grant. We know you have incredibly busy schedules and a lot of speaking engagements, and fitting us in, as well as the couple hundred people who registered to hear you speak, is very much appreciated. You've shared an awful lot of wisdom, and there is no doubt that this is an area of passion, not just profession, for either of you. I'd like us to think about the fact that true growth is rarely comfortable. So while in those moments where we're not comfortable, if we have the courage to keep going, that is when we're going to be able to make real differences. And I look forward to seeing all of you and everyone we could invite out on that dance floor. Feel like we belong. For the Labor Commissioner, it's a little bit of an unusual topic, but we have an invitation where we can collect questions anonymously and have them speak to how the commissioner is interpreting things specifically around wage and hour law in the world of remote work, as well as a lot of trends they're seeing on paid sick leave in California right now, especially in regard to how many of us in the trenches are not doing it right if we were ever called up before them. So a bit more of a tactical presentation, but we do want to balance the practice of HR, which is always these high thoughts and important work, along with the day-to-day nitty-gritty and compliance. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you again, Dr. Hines, Mr. Grant. I look forward to interacting with both of you for years to come. And yes, thank you so much, Jess, for championing this program and making it happen. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.